Welcome to the next installment in this mini-series on spiral dynamics, where we will be talking about stage green. Make sure you watch the prior episodes, stage blue and stage orange. So the progression that we're dealing with here on the spiral is beige, purple, red, blue, orange, and now we're at green, which I will be giving you many examples, probably over 100 different examples of in this episode. And this is another one of those episodes like orange, which is going to be very useful to you because the majority of you are probably within stage green somewhere. Now, I know I said that within stage orange as well, but you know what? Upon thinking about it a little bit more, what I came to realize that many people, when I started off Actualized.org 5 years ago, resonated with me who were orange because that's the kind of stuff I was talking about, success-based, achievement-oriented sort of self-help. And then I transitioned into more metaphysical topics, more stage yellow topics, and that probably alienated a lot of stage orange people because they would have found these metaphysical topics to be very impractical. So anyways, probably many of you are stage orange, stage green. And actually, just like most people in first world countries, you're probably stuck somewhere between orange and green. And very likely you are 50% orange, 50% green, or some combination thereof. That's what a lot of people in developed first world countries are in, especially if they're not in the rural areas, not in the country, but in the suburbs or in the urban areas, and especially those people who would have gone to college and have college degrees and are from sort of middle class and well-educated sort of areas, because your level of development corresponds to your level of education. So this stage is going to be very important for you to hear about, because you're going to hear about all the limitations of stage green and how to go about transcending it into yellow, which is tier 2 thinking, which is going to be some very advanced stuff. So this is going to be very exciting. Again, I want to give credit to Claire Graves, Don Beck, and Christopher Cohen for developing the bulk of this model. But I will be supplying a lot of examples and insights here that I sort of developed myself by thinking about this a lot, just in trying to understand this model for myself. What is the essence of green? We could say that it's relativistic, caring, communal, and environmental. So the pendulum has swung once again, as it does with every stage. It alternates between serving the self versus serving the collective. And this oscillates back and forth. So blue was serving the collective, orange was serving the self, and now green swings back to serving the collective, but in a more elevated way, a less dogmatic way than blue was doing it. So for green, we're now sacrificing the self not for some afterlife ideal of heaven, but we're sacrificing the self to create a more human community here on earth and to be accepted by this community, to be a part of this community. Green recognizes the validity of other cultures and species, which blue had some real problems with. Green recognizes the validity of different races. It's very multicultural and cosmopolitan in this manner. And green is all about equality and peace for all. World peace. Justice for everybody. So green is sort of reacting to the injustices of blue and of orange. Green is a rejection of shallow materialism, which came with orange, and it's a return to humanity and to spirituality, which also orange rejected. So green is sort of shifting away from just the cold, logical, rationalist, scientific metaphysics into a more new agey, hippie, sort of semi-spiritual, but not religious in the dogmatic sense that blue was religious. And green is all about love for your fellow man. If you want to encapsulate all of green into one word, it could be either peace or love. Well, that's 2 words. So when does green emerge? Why does green develop? Well, like we were talking about in the previous episode about orange, is that orange takes capitalism and materialism and rationalism to its pinnacle. And it turns out that when you do that, you start to see some nasty limits. And then green starts to emerge as those limits become obvious, and we see that we can't solve all of the world's problem by more money, by more economy, by more factories, by more pollution, by more Wall Street shenanigans, right? That's not going to solve the world's problems. So green emerges when materialism and success fails to feed the human spirit. You got a bunch of money in orange, but then you realized money doesn't buy me happiness. And there's still a hole inside of myself. I thought I would be happy and complete after I got my trophy wife, and after I got my big house, and after I got my fancy sports car, and after I banged a bunch of girls, and after I got myself a Rolex and all this. But then I discovered that it's like, man, this is very disappointing. It's so hollow. So I've chased success, I've achieved success, and now I'm asking myself, is that all there is? Could there be more to life? What am I missing here? Wait a minute. And then I start to realize that, hey, wait a minute, science and technology and capitalism are not all there is to life. And that actually I've been chasing the wrong thing. I've been chasing success when really what I should have been chasing is I should have been chasing connection and relationships. Life is not about things. Life is about people. It's about relationships. It's about deep human bonds. That's what's really satisfying, and that's when I'm starting to move into green. And as orange, I was always in this sort of competitive dog-eat-dog world of business, and now I'm starting to find that that gets weary and competition is draining. It's actually bad for your health. Wouldn't it be nicer if I just was able to cooperate? Why don't we all just cooperate rather than competing with each other? Isn't that a smarter way to live? Since we're all part of this community? See, green is waking up to the sense that, hey, it's not just about my own success, it's about the success of the whole community. And now for green, the community, the sense of what community means has expanded beyond blue. Because blue, if you remember, was also about promoting the community, except for blue is more about promoting the civilization, my civilization. And so it was my civilization against all the other civilizations. But for green, this has been softened. And now the sense of community is not just my race, it's not just my country or my state, it's the entire world. We're all human beings. There's no real boundaries between us. It doesn't matter what race you are, what gender you are, it doesn't matter. We're all part of the same community. We all basically want the same things. We want happiness. We want love. We want to live peacefully with each other. Everybody basically wants this. So let's give it to them. That's what green's about. So green develops a sort of desire for human connection and love, or rather orange develops that desire, and that's what moves orange into green. There's recognition of this larger global community. And now, as this happens, green starts to notice all the inequality and oppression in the world that was caused by blue and by orange materialism. And that starts to disturb green. It's like, wait a minute, why is there so much poverty? And why are there these sweatshops? And why are people being exploited? Why is there still slavery in the world? This is a travesty. We need to rise everybody up. We need to equalize the playing field. Also, orange, as it's moving into green, starts to realize the environmental impact that orange has been having. And this starts to disturb orange, and that's what turns it green. Because orange didn't care about the environment, didn't care about drilling for oil in Alaska, didn't care about oil spills, didn't care about pollution, didn't care about global warming. None of this stuff mattered because all that mattered was how much money I could get. So if I could pollute a little bit here and there, who cares? I'm just cutting corners to advance my success. That's what orange is about. But green now develops sort of social consciousness. And now green says, wait a minute, we're destroying Mother Earth. So there's this sort of sense of ecology now. And now orange starts to feel a little guilty about all the collateral damage that orange has done. And that moves them into green. there's a realization that orange is unsustainable. We can't keep doing what we're doing forever. We can't keep polluting. We can't just keep fishing. We can't keep killing all the whales because everything's going to die and we're going to live in a sort of bleak dystopian future. We need a more human, heart-centered approach. And also what moves orange into green is sometimes a health crisis, because orange was working so hard and eating all this toxic food and living in this toxic environment that a lot of times orange has serious health issues. Some kind of disease, gets poisoned, gets overstressed, gets burned out from overwork, and now orange realizes, no, I gotta chill out a little bit. I've been too neurotic with chasing success, and I got to start to enjoy life. Because look, I've been working 80-hour weeks and I've been acquiring all this money, but I haven't even had time to enjoy my money. I haven't even had time to go on a nice vacation or to spend time with my children. I spent 10 years working. My children went through their early childhood years. I didn't even get to see them because I was working so hard on Wall Street. Now I'm going to take some time off and spend it with the kids going to the zoo. It's that sort of mentality. If you really want to understand the core of green, think of green as a shift from the heavy left brain thinking of orange now into right brain thinking. Or think of green as opening up of the heart. That's really what it is. It's a flowering of your humanity. It's the flowering of empathy and compassion and a sense of community within you. Also, you could think of green as mellowing out orange, because orange was just too addicted to work and success and achievement and was not engaging enough with actually enjoying the journey and savoring the human qualities or aspects of life. Now, let me give you a list of green values. This is all the stuff that is near and dear to green's heart. If you're green, all of these are going to resonate with you. You are going to feel like this is what life is about. This is what reality should be about. This is what our politics should be about. This is what education should be about. This is what the books that I read should be about. This is what the videos I see on YouTube should be about. So here's green values. And you can use these keywords to really make a deep rapport with a green person. Love, heart, soul, empathy, intimacy, kindness, compassion, mercy, and leniency. Humanism, liberalism, social progress, equality, gender equality, racial equality, economic equality, social equality. Green fundamentally believes that everyone is equal. Egalitarianism and democracy. These are huge for green. Green is anti-materialist, anti-consumerist, and anti-greed. Green values having a social conscience. Green values supporting humanitarian causes. Green values activism and protests. Green has a live and let live attitude. Green is sort of chilled and laid back, although not always. Remember that these are generalizations, and so don't expect every single green person to fit this list perfectly, and don't expect yourself to fit this list perfectly. This is sort of green distilled down to its essence. Green values diversity and multiculturalism. Green values cosmopolitanism. Green values flattening of hierarchies, which were developed in blue, which blue valued so much. Green values cultural relativism, which just means that green values all sorts of different cultures. And green doesn't believe that its own culture is superior to every other one, the way that blue did. Green really values relationships and human bonding, pacifism and peace, finding common ground amongst people. So rather than fighting, what we should do is we should sit down and talk it out and find common ground. Green values harmony, living in harmony with your environment and also harmony between people. Green values human well-being, interpersonal skills, warm interactions, hugs, When you see green people hugging each other and it makes you uneasy, that means you're in orange. You're not comfortable with hugs, with human affection. And for a lot of left brain thinkers, that's something that you need to get over. So you just warm interaction. That's something that's foreign to many autistic type of people who sit at home playing video games all day. Yeah, of course, if you spend 10, 20 years playing video games, then you don't even know how to hug a human being. It feels uncomfortable to you. But that's what green is all about. When you see a big convention of green people gathering together, how do they greet each other? With big warm hugs and kisses and this sort of stuff, which you don't see in the business setting. Can you imagine a corporate boardroom, an orange corporate boardroom where everybody walks in and hugs each other? No, it's all formal and stiff and mechanical. So green is bringing the humanity and the heart back into human interactions. Green values pleasing everybody in the group, because we're trying to build a consensus here. We're not trying to exclude anybody. Green values sensitivity, femininity, and this one is huge because stage blue, well, really, even before that, stage red and blue and orange were all very patriarchal and sort of an exhibition of alpha male values. It was all about power and dominance in various different ways. And green is finally where femininity is allowed to flourish. And again, a lot of left brain dominant autistic type men and nerds have a big problem with this because they're sort of hooked on this sort of alpha, out alpha everybody else mentality. You're trying to be alpha. As a young man, you haven't found your identity yet. And so you have a problem with being feminine. You think that somehow emasculates you or makes you weak, when actually, in fact, what you realize when you go to the bottom, to the top of orange, you realize that actually, if I add femininity in with my masculinity, that's going to strengthen my masculinity. That's actually going to make me a stronger man. So green also values teamwork, dialoguing, sharing ideas and feelings, mind-altering drugs, psychedelics and weed and so forth, exploring altered states of consciousness, which is something that blue was too scared of. That was taboo for blue. And orange didn't care about either, because in orange's mind, there's only hard physical reality. So exploring altered states of consciousness, this is some sort of woo-woo stuff that orange doesn't want to do. Green values spirituality. Green can be spiritual but not religious in the way that blue was. And especially green values a communal sort of spirituality. So you see people coming together in yoga circles, meditation circles, and doing spirituality in some sort of communal way. Green values environment and ecology, going back to nature, learning lessons from Mother Nature, the wisdom of nature. Green values sustainability, recycling, human-centered and heart-centered communities, rather than cold, heartless machines where the human is just a cog in the machine. Here, every human in this little organization that green creates is going to know each other. There's going to be connections. It's sort of a social network rather than a top-down hierarchy. Green values protecting the vulnerable and helping the downtrodden, because when you're empathetic and your heart opens up, you realize that's who I should be caring about. I should be caring about the poor and the hungry and the diseased and the crippled and all this, because the rich people don't care about them. So who's going to care about them other than me? Green values redistribution of resources and leveling the playing field so everyone has an equal chance, because green is sad to see all the gross inequality that capitalism has created. Green values inclusiveness so that everybody in the group gets an opportunity to express themselves and to speak their agenda. So green doesn't want to exclude anybody, and green is very big on tolerance. Green values open-mindedness, being open to new ideas. Green values free love and intimate sex. Sex is deeper for green than for orange. For orange, sex was just like blowing your load and then getting on with life. It was about the excitement of it. Whereas for green, sex is going to be more about the intimacy and the connection. That's the difference between, I guess, left brain sex and right brain sex. Green values sex education because green is not shamed by sex the way that blue was. Green is comfortable talking about it. Green values cooperation versus competition. Green values animals, children, the disabled, and minorities, unlike the prior stages. Green values creativity, beauty, and art for art's sake. Not art to make lots of money, but just art for the sake of doing art. So for green, art is more true because art comes from the heart. It doesn't come from cold, rational business strategy. Green values gurus. There's a lot of guru worshiping going on with green. Green values bringing people of the world together. Green values socialism. Green values crying and expressing vulnerable emotions. Green values intuition over logic. The right brain, like I said. And green values health, food, and exercise more than the prior stages. So here's some characteristics of green. Green is about we the accepting versus I the capable. Orange was I the capable. I am the capable one. And now it's like, no, we as a community are going to be accepting and loving of everybody. Green is sacrificing the self for this social network community. For green, feelings and carings supersede cold rationality. Green is about joining a community to experience shared growth together. So that we're not just growing individually. I'm not just doing personal development by myself, but I'm doing personal development together with the community, and that enriches the entire process of personal development. Green reaches decisions through reconciliation and consensus, which sometimes can take a long time. Green is all about getting together and voting on stuff and talking it out rather than somebody just handing you down orders from up on high, because there's no hierarchy in green, or a flat hierarchy. Green is about dialoguing and mutual understanding. Green defines goals and objectives in human terms. So rather than judging my success or progress based on next quarter's profits or rise in GDP or some cold quantitative metric like that, green is going to use some kind of qualitative metric like happiness or love or peace, something soft and fuzzy like that, which of course drives orange mad because orange wants to quantify everything, and to orange it doesn't make sense how a goal or an objective can be something like love or happiness. This is fuzzy stuff for orange. It doesn't compute. So if you want to think of orange like Data, the robot from Star Trek, it's kind of like that. He can't really understand emotions, even though he tries to. He's trying to use his logical left brain to understand emotions, but really the only way you can understand emotions is through the heart. Green is characterized by seeking personal growth and introspection. So there's more emphasis on personal development than there was even in orange, because in orange, personal development was just like personal development to improve my skills so that I could be more successful. Whereas in green, personal development is oriented more, how do I make myself more aware of my emotions, my shadow side? How do I become a more loving and compassionate human being? It's a sort of softening of the orange style personal development. Green now is open to new age concepts that used to freak orange out. Stuff like the soul, spirit, reincarnation, Buddhism, the Tao, yoga, shamanism, karma, consciousness, love, intuition, EQ or emotional intelligence, energy, chi, finding God within, alternative medicine, Reiki, past lives, psychedelics, astral projection, channeling mysticism, Indian gurus, healing crystals, all sorts of organic stuff, veganism, Gaia, Mother Earth as a living being. All of these concepts, which were antithetical to orange's metaphysics, now become very acceptable for green's metaphysics. And green loves this stuff. And actually, green tends to go overboard with all this new age stuff, which is where we get this sort of stereotype of the new age hippie. Green is characterized by connecting with nature. Green is characterized by development of compassion and social networks. Green is tolerant and accepting of different views. Green seeks to communicate not just content, but also feelings. And again, this is something that's different from orange because orange didn't care about feelings. When orange people talk to each other, they're very pragmatic. It's like two computer programmers talking with each other. What do they talk about? They just talk about the cold, hard facts, and then they move on to their computers, right? They don't talk about their feelings about the cold, hard facts. It's like, just give me the cold, hard facts. Whereas green is like, no, let's take the time, let's make the space to discuss our emotions. How do you feel about this? Which can drive orange nuts. It's sort of the difference between the way that in a relationship, a man and a woman might talk to each other. You know, the man is going to talk more from a left brain perspective, just give me the facts. And the woman is going to talk more from a emotional perspective of like, how do I feel about the facts? I don't care about the facts. As a woman, I care about how I feel about the facts. The story behind the facts. Green is characterized by entrepreneurship, but tempered now with heart and humanity. So it's not that green is against business entirely. There are many entrepreneurs who are green or moving into green. There's actually many entrepreneurs, for example, in Silicon Valley, who are right at that cusp between like 50% orange, 50% green. They have one foot in both worlds. And so this is the type of entrepreneur, maybe like a good example would be Elon Musk, someone who is very success-oriented and still all about money and technology and all this stuff, but still he's now thinking about how do I create technology and how do I use my business in a more responsible manner such that I'm actually advancing mankind and I'm creating the kind of technologies that are actually going to help sustain the planet rather than destroy the planet. So that would be the difference between an entrepreneur like Elon Musk and an entrepreneur like someone who runs some big oil company or a giant bank on Wall Street. Green is characterized by nurturing employees. For orange, employees were just cogs in the machine. For green, green actually cares. A green CEO will actually go, he'll talk to his employees, he'll actually ask them how they feel, he'll ask for input, it'll be a more democratic process. Green is characterized sometimes by being emotionally needy. That can be a weakness. Green tends to reject displays of affluence. So green isn't so much about getting the fancy Rolex and the gold chain and this sort of stuff. It's more about developing yourself on the inside. For green, it's not what's on the outside of a person that matters. It's more what's on the inside that matters. And this is very different from orange. So an orange person, like when an orange man pursues a woman, it's all about her appearance, how hot she is. And so he's going to rank her on a scale of 1 to 10, and if she's above 7, maybe he'll sleep with her, and below that, he won't. So this is how an orange guy thinks. But a green guy is going to actually sort of start to abandon that whole notion, see the toxicity of that, and say, you know what, it's not about just the outward appearance, it's also about what's on the inside. It's about her psychology, it's about how compassionate she is, how much she cares about animals in the world and all this, how good of a person she is, what kind of energy and vibe that she gives me. So it's a deeper connection. And green is characterized by being individualistic in a conformist way, which is an interesting paradox. Individual in a conformist way. And of course, this is definitely possible. You see this in high school all the time, is you have high school kids like certain subcultures like the goths or the punks or something like that, which are trying to be individualistic, but they do it in a conformist way. So green is also sort of doing it that way. In blue, conformity was very strong, and everybody wore uniforms, and basically everybody conformed to the strict dictates of their culture. Whereas in green, it's all about, yeah, there's different cultures, we can pick and choose a little bit here and there. Green, everybody will dress differently and be individualistic, but still they do it in a conformist sort of way. So they will all dress, and they will all wear, like feather jewelry or some sort of hippie tie-dye clothes or some sort of natural cotton fibers or Lululemon yoga pants, sort of like this. You ever see that every girl in Whole Foods wears Lululemon yoga pants? I mean, it's not a problem, but it's just, it's funny. It's like you're trying to be individualistic, but really in a conformist sort of way. All right, so let's now get into all the juicy examples of green. Right at the top of the list, I have for you perhaps the epitome of green. If you take green to 11 and you still want a healthy functioning green, Burning Man is the perfect example. If you haven't heard of Burning Man, I highly recommend you check it out. Go to YouTube, Google some Burning Man videos, watch some documentaries about it. It's a pretty amazing little community they developed. Well, it's a large community. So it's this giant hippie city that gets created every single year around August time in the northern desert in Nevada. It's just like in the middle of nowhere, up north, almost by Oregon, in the corner, the northwest corner of Nevada. Everybody in the world comes together and they create a makeshift city in the middle of the desert. And it's like 50,000 people. They have photographs from aerial shots from airplanes of the city. It's gigantic. It's like and they bring everything there because there's no facilities, nothing. It's just like literally in the middle of the desert. And this whole thing is like a celebration, glorification of all of green's values. It's all these hippies that come there and they're all doing psychedelics and drugs and there's music festivals and they build these artistic sculptures and all sorts of wacky costumes. Everybody is dressed like Birdman and feathers and flowers and lights and flashy stuff. So like it's crazy. And they do this for a week and then they leave. And of course, as they leave, they pick up every scrap of trash and litter that they left behind. So they leave the desert completely clean the way that it was when they first arrived, because these are green people, so they're environmentally conscious, right? They're not going to trash the desert. So look at that. That's a really, really good example of healthy green. And in fact, if you want to really grow into green and to know what green is all about, I recommend you go to one of these Burning Man style festivals. They have the main Burning Man, which is in August every year. Tickets can be a little hard to get. They tend to be expensive because so many people want to go there. It's just this amazing cultural phenomenon every year. It's getting hard to sustain it. But they also have smaller Burning Man type festivals all around the world, in different states around the US and all different countries all throughout the year. So Google for those, check them out, and go there and just see what it's like. Meet those kinds of people and see how they think. They will think along this whole list of values that I'm talking about here. They're going to be very anti-orange. So of course, other examples include the hippies, the entire New Age movement and all the New Age stuff that there is, that you've heard about, the Green Party, Greenpeace, vegans and vegetarians, liberals, progressives, Democrats. Bernie Sanders is a really good example of green. President Obama was definitely an example of green. I put him at somewhere between green and yellow. He had those sorts of qualities. He also, of course, had orange qualities. But the reason that the conservative right hated Obama so much was precisely because blue reacts very negatively against green, because green is sort of a letting loose and this is kind of free love and it's a lack of discipline, whereas orange was all about discipline and conformity and dogma and kind of like sticking to cold, hard, like biblical scripture. Green is kind of like letting your love loose. And that freaks blue out. Blue is not comfortable with that. So that is the difference between, if you want to boil down the difference between a conservative and a liberal, is that a conservative skews more blue and a liberal skews more green, whereas the business people are sort of in the middle. And so the American political parties, the Republicans and Democrats, the Republicans are mostly halfway between blue and orange, and the Democrats are mostly halfway between orange and green. And so they are in this sort of perpetual tug of war with one another. And the more right-wing you are, the more blue you skew. And the more left-wing you are, if you're like a radical progressive, then the more full-on green that you skew. So a great example of this is TYT, the Young Turks YouTube channel. Everybody there is very progressive. They have a very progressive political ideology. And so they're a really good example of green. Bill Maher, The Daily Show, Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, Also, Sam Cedar's The Majority Report. Have you watched that one? It's a smaller, sort of progressive YouTube channel about politics. Actually really good. I highly recommend it. Sam Cedar is a really good example of a healthy version of green, because he's not one of these green people who's just like totally radically, unrealistically, idealistically liberal and progressive, but it's sort of progressivism and liberalism, which embodies all of the green values, but still in a rational manner, such that the policies are mostly rational and very well explained, very reasonable. So it's a perfect blend between like right brain and left brain. So you can check that out. John Oliver, of course. Democracy Now! Is another YouTube channel, which is progressive. All the liberal news media that the Fox News and the conservatives are up in arms about, like CNN, MSNBC, these of course skew green. And the reason that they skew green is not because they're bleeding heart liberals. Many of them are really, not that far away from orange. Because you gotta understand, CNN, MSNBC, first and foremost, these are orange companies because they're out to earn money. They are not radical progressives that want to equalize and level the playing field. No, they're very corporatist. And in that sense, they're rather conservative. They're there to preserve the status quo. But they appear like a liberal news media to people who are within the blue-orange range. You see, how you view other people will depend on where you are in the spiral. So it looks liberal when you're very conservative. So it's relative. You see, these judgments are relative. You've got Vox, Vice, these organizations who talk a lot about politics. They're quite progressive. The New York Times, MSNBC hosts like Rachel Maddow and Chris O'Donnell, CNN hosts, Keith Olbermann, Michael Moore, Al Gore, Donnie Deutsch, Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky's a really good example of a green intellectual, like really top-notch green, healthy green example. Sean Penn, Al Franken, social workers, community organizers, spiritual meetup groups, university culture. So when you hear about universities being very liberal and progressive, that's what I'm talking about. The social justice warriors, political correctness, LGBTQ rights, gender pronouns, protecting minorities, postmodernism, feminism. All of this that I'm talking about here now is getting into the Jordan Peterson territory, what he calls the neo-Marxists. Now, just very quickly, the problem with this, Jordan Peterson is a complicated figure. Again, I can't really go into all the nitty-gritty details here, but just so you kind of understand the big picture. A lot of the scientific stuff he talks a lot about psychological studies and Jungian archetypes and all this sort of stuff. That's fine. It's not a problem. Most of that stuff is accurate, and you can learn some good lessons from that. The problem is that Jordan Peterson sneaks in his sort of conservative political agenda into all of that in a sort of sneaky way. And what he does is he actually demonizes all of green. He takes this green category, which is this very broad category of all sorts of people, and most of them are very sane, very rational, very down-to-earth people. They're not crazy, radical leftists, right? Most people are not that. But he demonizes them because of some negative experiences that he personally has had within universities. Fine, he had a few negative experiences. Okay, I'll grant him that. But that doesn't mean that now every green or progressive person is a neo-Marxist. The problem with calling green people neo-Marxists is that the people who are listening to Jordan Peterson tend to sit in the blue to orange end of the spectrum on spiral dynamics. So when they start to hear neo-Marxists, they start to think of Marxists, the Soviet Marxists, the communists. So that triggers in them that sort of stereotype, and now they have this knee-jerk reaction against all the green stuff. Now Jordan Peterson, in a sense, radicalizes these people, and now these people get more stuck within blue and within orange, and they start to cling to that, and they are now not opening up to the next stage they need to pass through. See, green is not the end stage. Green is a stage you will pass through. Does green have excesses and dangers? Of course. Of course. Are there unhealthy manifestations of green? Of course. Every stage on the spiral has unhealthy manifestations. The danger is to overly focus on the unhealthy aspects of the stage above you, because when you do that, you demonize that stage, you judge it so much that you can't actually pass through it. And so Jordan Peterson himself is suffering from this, because what he would really want to do, if he wanted to develop himself to the highest levels and to actually connect with the God that he talks about so much, in theory, if he wanted to connect with it in practice, is that he would actually need to let go of his political agenda against the neo-Marxists, let that shit go, and then go and actually go to Burning Man, hang out with these people, realize that these are fun, loving, cool people. They're not crazy radical leftists. And you will realize oh, there's something I can learn there. I need to open my heart. I need to open the intuitive capacities of my body and my mind, and I need to become much more right-brained than left-brained. I need to see the limitations of orange and blue that I was stuck on, and then I will go into green, I will join green, and I will ultimately pass through green into yellow and turquoise and so forth. You see? So the problem is that there's sort of this barrier. Peterson is creating this sort of barrier for other people not to pass through, including for himself. And that's a shame. So that's my gripe with Peterson. And Peterson has some elements of yellow as well, but he can't fully enter yellow because he's still so busy judging and being angry. You can see the anger and the bitterness just in his tone. You can feel it. There's some kind of deeper shadow side anger issue that he hasn't resolved, and that's why he's got this axe to grind against the neo-Marxists. So what I recommend is that you drop this label neo-Marxist, because really green, it's a real disservice to call them neo-Marxists, because Marxists were actually blue and red. Those were Soviet Marxists. These green that we're talking about, they are not going to create some sort of radical revolution to destroy society the way that Jordan Peterson paints it out to be. It's not going to be like that. That's not what they want. What they want is they want a softening of this just stifling capitalism. They want a softening of that. And you may agree or disagree with the politics there, and you may have your opinions about how far green we should go, and that's all fine. And you can criticize some aspects of green because there are some excesses of green. That's fine. But the main thing is that you want to grow into green and past green rather than waste your time criticizing it. And the more you start coming up with these stupid labels like social justice warriors and feminazis and all this and neo-Marxists, you come up with these labels, it doesn't help you to develop yourself. It only hinders you. Other examples of green: abortion rights, Planned Parenthood, pacifism, ACLU, the Me Too movement, Antifa. That would be a sort of unhealthy radical example. The problem would be to think that everything I'm talking about here falls under the label Antifa. That would be the big mistake. That's the problem. If you see, for example, on Fox News, whenever something with Antifa comes up, they will use Antifa as a way to smear the entire green stage of the spiral, which of course is a big problem because they're in a blue-orange stage. So really, they have more growing to do to get to green. But of course, the ego mind loves to demonize that which it is afraid of and that which would force it to grow and to evolve to a higher level of consciousness. Other examples: support groups, tree huggers, bleeding hearts, Care Bears, animal rights, anti-war protests, Occupy Wall Street. That was a very green movement. Charities, nonprofits, NGOs, organic farming, organic food, recycling, global warming, music festivals, flower children of the 60s. In fact, the entire 60s counterculture movement of the hippies, that was very green. Haight-Ashbury, Woodstock, the Beatniks, the Beatles, John Lennon, Bob Marley, Willie Nelson. Of course, marijuana legalization is a very green topic. Psychedelics, Timothy Leary, Terence McKenna, Ram Dass. See, psychedelics are not effective on blue people because blue people are so closed-minded, they won't be able to really appreciate the insights that psychedelics deliver because they're not open enough. And they won't really work on orange people because orange people are so set on success and personal achievement and sort of selfishness that they're too busy to really delve into psychedelics. In fact, what will happen to you as an orange person if you start to take psychedelics, and this is what happened to me, is that you're going to be in this sort of business phase where you're doing business, you're working really hard. Then you take these psychedelics open you up. And if you fully surrender to them, you'll realize like, holy shit, all this work and business and money chasing sex that I'm doing, all this stuff is so shallow compared to what the psychedelics showed me. And so what's going to happen for you, maybe for a year or two, like what happened with me, is that your productivity is going to tank. And if you're not prepared for this, you might think, oh no, this is a problem. My business is crashing. I'm learning less money. I'm having less sex. I'm buying less sports cars. Your productivity is tanking, right? But that's just because you're working less. You're realizing that working is so hollow compared to connecting with the metaphysical aspects of reality. And the psychedelics, what they do is they sort of slow you down, which is actually a good thing. That's exactly what you need. But for Orange, who doesn't realize that that's exactly what he needs, that can create a problem. So watch out for that. Psychotherapy, progressive school teachers, liberal Supreme Court judges, the Ninth District Circuit Court of Appeals, socialists, the redistribution of wealth, drum circles, neo-shamans, communes. Actually, let me make a point about socialists. So again, the conservatives and blue and orange will make a big boogeyman out of socialism. Again, this conflates the socialism of the Soviet era and the Chinese-style socialism, which is actually blue. It's a dogmatic, ideological, hierarchical form of socialism, and actually that's why it failed, versus socialism at green. Socialism at green is not interested in, for example, eliminating private property and confiscating all your wealth. That's not what it wants to do. Yes, socialists want to tax you more. Yes, they want more government programs. Yes, they have liberal policy positions you may or may not agree with. Yes, of course. But don't paint them as this boogeyman, like they're going to come and they're going to take away all your private property. No. Look at how socialism works in Northern European countries, for example. They still have private property. Sure, they have high taxes and stuff, and maybe you don't want to go there. Maybe you don't want that kind of politics in America. That's fine. That's your prerogative. That's your perspective as blue and orange. But don't paint this out to be a boogeyman. Socialist societies definitely work. We see examples of them working, and in many ways, they work better than American societies. Those societies have better access to healthcare. They generally have more equality. They have benefits for mothers, maternity leaves, vacation, and all this. So there's a lot of good stuff that comes from those kinds of policies. So be careful into falling into this Jordan Peterson trap of painting the socialists of green with the socialists of blue. Because Jordan Peterson will tell you like, oh, but look at all the evils of the 20th century and how terrible that was and how many tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people died under socialism. That is what I mean by creating a boogeyman. That is not what happens with green socialist-leaning policies. Now, of course, there can always be excesses. At every stage, there can be excesses. At every stage, policy can be damaging in different ways to different segments of society. So, of course, there can be excesses. I'm not saying that socialism should just be let, free reign to do anything it wants. Of course, if you do that, there will be excesses and dangers. But that's true of any policy, whether it's conservative or liberal. You always need moderation, you always need balance, you always need harmony. Other examples: Doctors Without Borders, universal healthcare, sensitivity training, non-denominational churches are green, health food stores, Whole Foods, of course, it's a good bastion of green people, go there. One thing I would say about Whole Foods is that it's really sort of a blend of half orange, half green. It's not pure green by any means. It's still a business, and a lot of people who go there are sort of upscale businessy types, and yuppies and entrepreneurs like to shop there. A lot of orange people like to shop at Whole Foods just because it has good food. An interesting example about Whole Foods, which illustrates perfectly the mindset and value system of green, is the following. I read that long ago in Whole Foods' early history, they used to sell rabbit meat at the meat section at the Whole Foods. But apparently the green customer base who visits Whole Foods were so offended by this because these were bunnies, basically, chopped up bunny meat, was lying there next to the cows and the chickens. Of course, there's no reason why a bunny is any more valuable or deserves more compassion than a chicken or a cow. But in Green's thinking, because it's sensitive, because it's more emotional, when it makes that connection with seeing bunnies butchered at the butcher counter, it gets offended. And so there was such a brouhaha about this that Whole Foods was forced to remove rabbit meat from its shelves. And, I don't know, I haven't gone to all the Whole Foods all around the US, but the Whole Foods that I have been to in my area, in California, in Nevada, in Texas, I have not seen any butchered rabbit meat there. So I guess that's their policy. But that shows you sort of how Green thinks and a little bit of the hypocrisy of Green. So if you are blue or orange and you feel that Green is being hypocritical, we'll get to that. We'll get to that at the end of this video. I'll be talking about the unhealthy and excesses and dangers of Green. Yes, there definitely is some hypocrisy within Green, but of course, you got to also recognize that there's hypocrisy with every stage. Every stage has its own forms of hypocrisy. So don't be too smug and too self-righteous. Other examples: Western yoga, Reiki, Western forms of Buddhism, massage therapy, chiropractors, naturopaths, meditation as a fad, transcendental meditation, crystals, yoni eggs, juice cleanses, detox, green smoothies, colonics, spas, scented candles, burning of incense, aromatherapy, tie-dye t-shirts, kombucha, probiotics, soy, gluten-free products, farmers markets, non-GMOs, fair trade, Che Guevara, Oprah Winfrey, Nelson Mandela, Pope Francis. He's an interesting character because to me, he looks like he's got 1 foot in blue and 1 foot in green, which is actually kind of cool. I actually like this Pope because traditionally I wouldn't like a Pope because he would be all blue, but this Pope actually has heart. Like, he comes out and he has some very liberal positions on certain things. He cares about global warming. He cares about the environment. He cares about children and this and that. Now, of course, there's still a lot of corruption in the church, so I'm not saying he's flawless and he's perfect. There's still a lot of dogma in the Catholic Church, which I'm sure is imprinted in his mind for the rest of his life. So there's definitely problems there. But as far as popes go, he's a pretty good example because his blue is tempered by green. When religion and church groups start to move more into green, they become a lot more healthy and a lot less susceptible to the criticisms that orange had of fundamentalist religion, because they stop being fundamentalist and they actually start to embody more the core teachings of Jesus or other spiritual teachers, which was really just about love. It was about caring for poor people, caring for sick people. It was about social justice. I mean, that's fundamentally what Jesus was preaching. It was social justice. Jesus was a social justice warrior, flipping over the moneylender's table. What is that but social justice? I mean, Jesus was a socialist or a communist in the most in the most like basic sense, which is so ironic because when you look at the Fox News audience and Fox News anchors and they talk about Jesus as being as though Jesus was a conservative, a conservative capitalist. That's not what Jesus was. Jesus was a radical leftist. He was so radically leftist that if he were alive today, he like the right would completely tear him apart. They would demonize him to no end, which is so ironic. But of course, that's exactly what blue religion does, because blue religion cannot deal with the freedom and the radical open-mindedness and just the radical openness of a deeply mystical spiritual person. That runs counter to all of the religious dogmas, you see. But that's a topic for another day. Other examples: anti-vaxxers, Hollywood politics, which, like I said in the Orange episode, is distinct from Hollywood business. Hollywood business is orange. Hollywood politics that you see, the actors giving those Oscar speeches with very liberal values, those are the Hollywood politics I'm talking about for this list. Saving the Whales, the Esalen Institute, but also that's also yellow. Humanistic psychology, transpersonal psychology, cooperatives, co-ops, Montessori schools, Scandinavia, Scandinavian countries, the Scandinavian prison system, which is very lenient and liberal, places like California, San Francisco, Oregon, Austin, Massachusetts, Sedona, Arizona is a bastion of green. Super green, but also really cool city. New York, Seattle, Hawaii. Hawaii's very green. Canada, Northern Europe, Germany. Germany is doing some very green stuff with their renewable energy, which is cool. The Netherlands, Switzerland, Iceland. So these are all the countries. And notice these are very healthy countries by and large, or countries, states, or cities. Generally, they're very well functioning. And in many ways, they're more successful than their orange and blue counterparts. So that's the counter evidence to what Jordan Peterson is preaching to you about these radical neo-Marxists. You know, they have pretty good living conditions. Other examples of green: denuclearization, equal pay, free college for all, universal basic income, amnesty, affirmative action, gun control, the assault weapons ban. Green tends to be pro-union, pro-EPA, pro-cutting the defense budget. They are very much against the military-industrial complex. Open borders, higher taxes, lenient penalties, abolishing the death penalty, drug rehab centers, homeopathy, astrology, hypnosis. The Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation tends to skew green because it's trying to help the world with vaccines and so forth. Dr. Albert Schweitzer is a really good example of a religious person who was heavily green in a time where very few religious people were green. This was over, almost like 100 years ago. Martin Luther King, JFK, RFK, these skewed green. Life coaching tends to be a very green career choice. Children's rights advocates, protecting endangered species tends to be a very green cause. Mentoring programs, helping the elderly, cleaning up the environment, the Back to Earth movement, people wearing more natural clothing, cotton clothing, natural fiber type stuff. Minimalism, the Peace Corps, the plot from Avatar with those blue alien creatures, cat creatures, who were supposed to like be the embodiment of, well, actually they were purple, sort of purple leaning, but the humans who were fighting on behalf of the blue cat aliens, they like the main character, he was basically green, and his friends who were fighting the evil Orange Corporation. Civil rights, human rights, watchdog groups, the Prius, Tesla, the smart car, that little car that you see driving around, that's a green type of car. Electric scooters, commuting to work on bicycles, solar power, wind power, renewable energy. The corporate culture at Google and at Apple tends to be more green. So if you're looking at examples of what does a green corporation look like, is green about abolishing corporations? No, not necessarily. There are green corporations you can find, and Google and Apple represent a couple of really good examples of that. Now, again, be careful here. I'm not saying that Google and Apple are totally green. They're still very corporatist. They still do a lot of manipulative and shady stuff. They're still very materialistic. There's still a lot of, they're earning billions of dollars. So, and they have abuses, like Apple has those famous abuses with iPhones being manufactured in China and people jumping out of windows and all this because of the cruel working conditions. Yes, that still goes on, but still, when you compare Apple's culture and Google's culture here in America, at least, at their campuses, even the way their campuses are structured, when you compare that with more traditional corporations like a giant oil company or something, you will see that they are much more green in their values. For example, Google offers all sorts of socialist benefits, neo-Marxist benefits to its employees, like a free childcare, free cafeteria with healthy organic food, and like all this sorts of stuff, right? So all this stuff, that's why people love working at Google. And in fact, Google has or I don't know if they still have it, but they used to have this slogan, don't be evil. That was Google's slogan. It's like, we can do business, but we don't have to be evil and cutthroat in the way that we do business, which is right there. I would say Google and Apple are really like half orange, half green. And if you take a look, for example, at Tim Cook, Apple's CEO, he's the first openly gay CEO, I believe. And you can tell in his value system, a lot of his value system, the way he treats his employees, the way he thinks about the future of the company, the way he thinks about how Apple serves a certain role within society, not to let it be abused by the government, to spy on people, that sort of stuff. These are green values that he's espousing. So he's got a social conscience. Other examples: warning stickers, safety codes, talk therapy, grown men crying, utopian communes. The personal development company Mind Valley. Are you familiar with that one? They do a lot of self-help courses. It's a very green sort of company. The movie Into the Wild with the main character, Chris McCandless. That is a great example of the green mindset. Chris McCandless was a very green, idealistic sort of guy, so he abandoned his fancy college career, and he just abandoned his car. He just went hitchhiking and vagabonding across America and ultimately ended up, I think, in Alaska, where he got caught and trapped between some river that melted, and he got trapped like on this little island all by himself, like camping in a abandoned bus, and then he ate some poison berries and basically he starved to death. But it's a really touching story of sort of the idealism of green, but then also how green can be so idealistic that it goes wrong, which is what happened to him. So it's kind of tragic. And that is a theme for green, is that green has all this heart, but there's also some tragic aspects to green, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. The United Nations skews green, although it's got plenty of orange in it as well. Cultural appropriation, or at least people being upset about cultural appropriation, is a very green thing. Activists, local co-ops, mental health professionals, teachers. Have you seen the ultra spiritual guy on YouTube? So he is he's not criticizing. He's basically making a mockery of all the excesses of green. That's what he's doing. And that's why his channel is so popular. So the problem with it, though, is that I get the sense that a lot of blue/orange people watch the ultra spiritual guy, and of course they laugh. It's super funny, and everything he says has a ring of truth to it. But the problem is that if you're at stage orange or orange-blue, and you're watching these videos and you're laughing and you're ridiculing green, the problem is that, again, it's going to create this sort of Jordan Peterson style demonization stereotype in your mind of green, and then you're not actually going to be able to grow into green because you've been laughing at it for 3 years solid. You see the problem with that? So, I mean, you can definitely make fun of green, but make sure that you're not taking that too seriously. Like, make fun of green, but don't actually think that green is bad, because you should see yourself as becoming green, and then, of course, transcending green. Tantric sex tends to be a very green thing. Ayahuasca retreats. Conscientious objectors, very green. Yin-yang and peace tattoos. The peace symbol. What is the peace circle in it? How about Osho? Osho's ashram. Osho himself was pretty advanced, but his ashram, if you see in the documentary that I posted on my blog, and we talked about it on the forum, Osho's ashram, the Rajneeshis in Oregon, that was, if you watch that entire documentary, I mean, Sheila was sort of an outlier. She was kind of a crazy character. But if you just look at the vibe and the culture and the values of that community, that was a very green, typical green example. Russell Brand, if you like him, he's really good at embodying green. And then lastly, again, we come to Sam Harris. Now, I said in the orange video that Sam Harris is a complicated figure, and he is. And the reason I bring him up here again is because his metaphysics, in a sense, is very rationalist and materialist, which makes him orange in that sense. But I think that Sam Harris is a liberal. I mean, he's got a lot of liberal positions. He's open to a lot of liberal ideas and values generally. So Sam Harris definitely has lots of green in him as well, even though he has a lot of criticism against the excesses of green, which some of those are certainly valid, and we'll be talking about them here in a minute. So notice, that's the end of our list of examples. So notice all the different shades of green. There's a lot here, a huge diversity. All right. So be careful about stereotyping this or pigeonholing people or calling all of these people neo-Marxists. Also notice that in our society today, if you live in a big city in a relatively liberal state in the US, for example, like California or New York or Oregon or Washington, this sort of stuff, Florida, you see a lot of orange fused with green in the sense that you have orange consumerism, which is fused with green values. So you have values like meditation and spirituality and yoga and all this sorts of stuff, but then you see it sort of cheapened by this mass market consumerism, which is a little bit of sort of like what Oprah does. And I'm not really criticizing this. I think it's a necessary step in the evolution, because our culture right now really is evolving towards this sort of orange, half orange, half green stage. And so, of course, you would expect that orange consumerism in business would fuse with some of the higher ideals of green. But you also have to understand the danger of this is that it sort of cheapens and takes the hard edge off of things like yoga. It's really hard to find a yoga teacher these days, especially in the West, who will teach you a nice, strong form of yoga that's actually designed to enlighten you. Most yoga in the West is about bending yourself into a pretzel and doing some weird stuff, joining a class, being part of a community. I mean, and they don't even talk about enlightenment. Nobody in those classes even has a clue of what enlightenment is, even conceptually. Or if they have a conceptual clue, they certainly haven't realized the radical depth of what enlightenment really means, and they've never really actually experienced it. To them, it's just a belief. So watch out for that problem. Green consumerism. All right, let's take a quick intermission here, and when we come back, we'll talk about some of the excesses of green and then how to transcend green. All right, let's talk about some slogans that epitomize green. Love conquers all. Sharing is caring. Make love, not war. Everyone is equal. Everyone is beautiful in his or her own way. Everyone is right in his or her own way. We're all in this together. Live and let live. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Can't we all just get along? And now let's talk about what triggers green. Every stage, you have to understand, has its own trigger points. People on the right and conservatives like to criticize green because they say, oh, green are snowflakes, they get triggered. But the truth is that conservatives also get triggered. Stage blue gets triggered. Stage orange gets triggered by its own stuff. And of course, stage green gets triggered. Now, because green is more emotional and it's more sensitive to the oppressed and minorities and civil rights issues and human abuses like this, then it is more sensitive in a certain sense to getting triggered. But again, it just all depends. It's very easy to trigger a blue fundamentalist religious person, like extremely easy. And you can also trigger orange people as well. So don't think that triggering is somehow exclusive to green. So here's what triggers green, though. Injustice and inequality. Oppression of minorities. The status quo and hierarchies of power, especially if the status quo is some sort of old hierarchy which is fundamentally unfair or unjust to certain groups of people, like you might think of, for example, the Indian caste system. That kind of caste system would be very upsetting to green because it marginalizes so many people and keeps them down. Green is also triggered by when religion is used to justify oppression. Like when someone in a position of power justifies their oppression of minorities or of children or of animals or something like that by quoting scriptures from the Bible or in the name of Allah, that can trigger green. Human rights abuses, racism, bigotry, fascism, neo-Nazis, the KKK, the Charlottesville example that happened in America here last year, incidents like this can be very triggering to green, which is why green will then go out and will want to protest and will want to go to these to these like white supremacist rallies and do a kind of a counter protest thing because they want to stand up to that, because they're standing up against human rights abuses in their eyes. That's what they're doing. Green can be triggered by unchecked capitalism. So sometimes in the news, we see these situations where some drug company puts out a drug that they know wasn't safe, that kills lots of people or poisons lots of people. That sort of situation will trigger green. Or when some company will price gouge some children for their drug that they need, some cancer medication, they raise the price by 500% because they know they can make the money or something like so stuff like this. Also, green can be triggered by consumerism, various forms of corporatism, corporate greed, Wall Street, CEOs getting golden parachutes while their companies tank, sweatshops, exploitation, especially around the world in many third world countries. There's a lot of instances where first world countries, especially America, because of its capitalistic ambitions, are exploiting third world countries and making situations there much worse than they would have otherwise been. Green can be triggered by environmental destruction and pollution. Green is triggered by lack of empathy and cold-heartedness, just generally speaking. Animal cruelty is big for green. That's a big trigger point. Green starts to develop a special connection with nature and with animals that a lot of blue and orange people just can't understand. You know, a stereotypical example of how to trigger a green person is to take a basket of kittens and lower it into a pit of lava. That would trigger green. And that's something that an unhealthy version of blue or orange might do just to amuse themselves, just to spite green. You also notice this phenomenon happening with orange-blue people is that they sort of want to stick it to green. There's just sort of this idea that, oh, let's just do something to piss green off to trigger green. And because green is sensitive, they know that, oh, if I just do something cruel or I say something ugly or I say something racist or whatever, then I can trigger green in this way. And you can, but the cost of that is that if you're participating in that, then really what you're doing, you're participating in a sort of very childish, juvenile behavior there. And you're just entrenching yourself deeper into your blue and into your orange, when really you should be opening your mind up to green, because you're going to have to pass through green to get to yellow. Green can be triggered by war, genocide, rape, torture, abuse, school shootings, mass shootings, and poverty, fascism and authoritarianism, the exclusion of people from the group. Like if you don't let somebody speak because you just want to exclude them. Green can be triggered by libertarians. Of course, Donald Trump triggers green people a lot. He sort of is the antithesis of everything that green is about. This kind of selfishness, this narcissism, and this pandering to blue. Conservative Supreme Court, that's triggering a lot of green people these days. And just in general, progressives are triggered by the backwardness of society. What progressives see is they see 50 to 100 years into the future of what society could be like. But because a giant chunk of the population is stuck in blue and is also feeding into orange, that progressives are never really able to get the kind of progress that they know we're capable of as a society. And so the frustration for many progressives is it's like, we know what society could be in 50 or 100 years, and we know that really, if people were more open-minded, we would have that society today, and it would be a more fair, more democratic, more egalitarian society, and it would be better for everybody on the whole. But of course, there are elements of society which are holding us back, because the ego wants to maintain homeostasis. And in my episode where I talk about collective ego, I talked about how every political system, every social organization, including, of course, all the progressive ones, they also have collective ego. They're trying to maintain their position. But a feature of the progressives or the Greens' collective ego is progress and evolution, whereas a feature of the blue collective ego is maintaining the status quo. And so there's always this tension in society, and there's always more people in society who are stuck in traditionalism and traditional values than they are in the future and in progress. And so this is not just some recent development within American politics, for example, that I'm talking about. This has been going on for 2,000 years. There was always, in every single society, in every single culture, there was the large majority of the culture, which was generally traditional and conservative and was just kind of like satisfied with the way the culture is, and they would just want to preserve it. And then there were a few people, a smaller segment, who wanted progress. And, you know, there's a range. Some people want a little bit of progress. Some people want a huge amount of progress. Some of the progress that people want could be completely unrealistic, can be unattainable in the time frames that they envision. But nevertheless, you know, there's always a progressive element that's kind of pushing society forward. And so there's this tug of war between how fast should we be going forward. The problem for conservatives in blue is that everything in reality is always evolving. So you can't stay in the same place forever because you're going to go extinct. But then the question is, okay, so we're moving forward, but the question is, how fast do we want to move forward? And the problem is that if you move forward too fast, then you get ego backlash. So it's this careful balance. Every system, I'm not just talking about politics here. I'm not just talking about America. I'm talking about every single system, whether it's your mind, whether it's your life, whether it's your family unit or your business or your whatever, your political party. It's always fighting this tug of war between how fast should it evolve. And if it evolves too slow, it could die. And also, if it evolves too fast, it can encounter all sorts of problems with that as well. So that's the balancing act that life plays out for us. Now let's talk about the unhealthy manifestations of green and also its excesses. This is what happens when you take green too far. Green can get too easily offended and too sensitive. It would help green to develop a thicker skin because not always will people play to your sensitivities. And sometimes reality is brutal and harsh. And green can be a little bit unrealistic in terms of that. Green can be too idealistic and too impractical. Sometimes green has too much heart and not enough head. It cares a lot, but it doesn't really create a strategy or a plan, or it lacks the discipline to actually act out on the feelings. Green likes to talk a lot and to get a consensus, but just talking and sharing feelings and getting a consensus and having a dialogue does not actually produce the result, which can be a problem for green. So it can be a little bit up in the clouds and not grounded enough. And so with green, you can get social revolutions, but then they don't actually last. They sort of turn into fads. Another excess and unhealthy manifestation of green is a sort of groupthink or mob mentality that happens. Green can be ideological. In fact, every stage is ideological in its own way. Ideology is not reserved only for blue. Orange has its own capitalistic ideology. Those are the libertarians. And green has its own sort of progressive ideology. And it can also kind of get wrapped up and caught up. Like maybe you're a student on a college campus and you just get caught up with some feminist movement that's going on there, or some civil rights movement or something else. And maybe the movement overall, it's a good idea and it had some good intention when it started, but then it can go too far, right? You join a protest group and then everybody starts doing something, breaking windows, whatever, and then you kind of get sucked into it and kind of go into it and you just kind of buy into it because remember, green was a shifting of the pendulum into a sort of collective attitude away from the orange individualist. So of course, the pendulum always overcompensates, overreacts, and swings too far, which is why the pendulum then needs to swing back. And so with green, yes, conservatives sometimes criticize green because they can be like a herd or like a mob, and that's true. Of course, conservatives also fall prey to that exact same problem, just in different ways. So watch out for that if you're green. Another unhealthy manifestation is that green tends to demonize materialism because green has swung away, reacted against orange, and oftentimes green didn't actually fully integrate orange. It just reacted as a knee-jerk move away from orange. And so now green thinks that all business and corporations and money, that is the root of all of our problems. If we could only stop corporations, then everything would be solved for society. That's not true, of course. The situation is much more complicated and nuanced than that. And the fact is that green is a stage that's built upon orange. So green doesn't replace orange. That's a big mistake. Green is the next step up. It includes and then transcends orange. So it's not right to think of business as being evil, because then you're going to start to judge it, and then what's going to happen is that you're going to have a dysfunctional relationship with it. And the fact is that society needs business. We're always going to have business. It's not whether we should have business or not have business, or whether we should have capitalism or not have capitalism. We will always have capitalism. It's a question of to what degree, how do you mitigate it, how do you soften it, how do you properly regulate it. The devil is in the details there, so be careful not to demonize. Another problem with green is that green tends to not appreciate the necessity of the lower stages like I'm talking about. Blue and orange are necessary. Those are the steps you take to get to green. Sometimes what green will do is green will try to go to some third world country, which is quite backwards and undeveloped, like maybe in the Middle East somewhere, where many of the people in the Middle East are in even a purple and a red, not even blue yet, purple and red. Much of their population is still there. Very low level of development, very tribal culture. They're just starting to move into blue and orange. And green tries to come in there and tries to spread green ideals of animal rights and civil rights and women's rights and all this, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work because you're preaching a level of development that cannot be sustained because there's a lack of just basic fundamental infrastructure, both cultural infrastructure, but also actual physical infrastructure. You know, like people in Africa and in the Middle East, many of them just like need basic government utilities and functions. They need to be able to get a job. They need to be able to get vaccines for their children, just like very basic stuff. They got to fix that stuff before they can start to care about animal rights and world peace and global warming and green energy. And so green can be so idealistic that it fails to see that, fails to appreciate those stages. And green might want someone from some like African nation who is in purple, very deeply tribal, you know, like village society. They want them to jump to green. But that's not going to work. And so if you go there, you try to maybe build a school or some charity organization that tries to get those African kids to green, it's not going to work. You need a much more smarter approach, which once you get to yellow, you start to see that, oh, the entire spiral is necessary. Every stage has a reason for being. And so it makes no sense to criticize the lower stages, nor does it really make sense to try to speed up the process too much. Because if you try to get people to move up the stages too quickly, they won't fully integrate them, and actually it'll backfire and fail to work. And that's one of the problems that a lot of NGOs and charities and nonprofit groups that try to work in the Middle East or in Africa, they face this problem. They try to help from a green stage when really they need to be working with the needs of the people. You got to meet the people where they're at, not where you're at, which can be difficult for an idealistic person to do. Green can fail to appreciate the complexity of the economy. Sometimes green thinks that, oh, if we just raise taxes, or if we just do this, or we just cripple corporations, that will solve the problems. When in reality, the economy is a very complex thing. It can have counterintuitive repercussions. So your policies need to be very carefully tested. Green can be too relativistic, which leads to a sort of false equivalency effect, where green says, oh, well, all cultures are basically equal. They're all on the same playing field. And so therefore the culture in America is at the same level. Leo, you can't say that American culture is more developed than Middle Eastern culture, African culture. That's not politically correct. Or right? That's you setting up a hierarchy. And maybe green might even say that spiral dynamics is a hierarchy and we need to destroy this hierarchy. Well, the fact is that there are different levels of development, and human beings in different cultures have different levels of consciousness. Some are more developed and more complex than others. And that's not a moral judgment. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm not saying Africa is worse or the Middle East is worse than America or Europe. It's just different levels of development. From the biggest picture perspective, there is no good and bad here. It's all just a very complicated bootstrapping process that is unfolding. It's evolution unfolding within human societies. And so you don't criticize the dinosaurs for being dinosaurs and not being birds or not being mammals or not being apes. It's like you got different animals who occupy different niches and they need to be that way. You know, we still have crocodiles and alligators. And you might say, well, the crocodiles and the alligators, they're so backwards because they existed 100 million years ago and they still exist today. So how come they aren't more advanced creatures? How come they aren't apes? Well, because there are still niches in the world where being a crocodile or an alligator is the perfect fit. And you, as a really good zoologist, need to understand that. And then, of course, apply that to human societies. Another excess of green is a sort of naive pacifism. Sometimes green, because green loves peace and love so much that they fail to appreciate some of the hard and brutal realities of conflict. They think that love and peace can solve all problems, when in reality it's much more complicated than that. Love and peace cannot solve all problems. And so taking just this kind of attitude that, oh, we should just abstain from all wars, abstain from all intervention, abstain from all violence, and that will be the perfect scenario. Well, actually, counterintuitively, what might happen if you do that is that actually you will bring upon more war or even more violence. So you have to be careful. It takes complex thinking to really understand how conflict works. Sometimes green wants to flatten hierarchies too much. Sometimes a hierarchy is necessary to have a functioning government or a functioning organization or a functioning corporation. You flatten it too much, then there's no clear decision maker, there's no clear leader in the organization, and so the whole thing is just kind of this mushy mess. Decision making takes a long time and takes a lot of resources, and so you have a lot of dialoguing and consensus building, but in the end of that, no action gets taken. Sometimes green is not action-oriented enough, not pragmatic enough. That can especially happen when green hasn't fully integrated orange. Because really, if you properly integrate orange, you will learn the lessons of pragmatism there. And in fact, you'll probably go overboard. And in that case, you move into green and everything will be fine. But a lot of people these days, they get sort of imprinted with green values early on in their development and their education, especially if you grow up in a progressive area or with a liberal family. But then you have not integrated all of the orange lessons and even some of the blue lessons. And this is where you get some problems arising. Like you get the phenomenon of the deadbeat hippie who can't have a job and who can't manage his finances, and he just kind of goes and mooches off his friends, even though he has high ideals of love and peace, but he can't even keep a job, pay his bills. That would be an example of someone who fails to properly integrate orange. So watch out for that trap. Green can have extremist elements because green has that mob mentality a bit. It's collectivist. So sometimes you get involved with a group, and like I said in my collective ego episode, individually, us humans, we tend to be pretty nice and kind, but when you get us into a mob, all sorts of mayhem happens. It doesn't matter if it's a blue mob or an orange mob or a green mob. So examples of extremist elements of green might be PETA, some of the actions of Greenpeace, or Antifa. But remember that these are by and large rare. Not all green people fall into this trap. Green can be too touchy-feely and too emotional. Sometimes green's emotions don't allow it to do the things that need to be done. Sometimes green is so compassionate that it falls into the trap of only seeing compassion as feminine compassion. I have an older episode where I talk about the distinction between feminine and masculine compassion. And both of these have a need depending on the situation. Feminine compassion is when you kind of coddle a person and you kind of try to soothe them and help them as much as you can. And then masculine compassion is sometimes when you deliver the brutal truth. And sometimes that's what you need, is you need to deliver the brutal truth. You need to speak something harsh, but then that harshness is actually what gets the solution. It actually helps the person. It can actually be more compassionate. The reason it's more compassionate is because, well, like, look, for example, a lot of women can have this problem in a relationship. Like, a woman can be in a relationship with some, let's say, guy who's a jerk. But because she's very compassionate and she doesn't want to disappoint this guy, and she doesn't want to not love this guy by leaving him, so she just justifies in her mind staying in this relationship for another 10 years. And so it just keeps dragging on and on. They keep fighting and he keeps abusing her and being a jerk to her. And this whole thing, it just turns into a giant mess. When the proper step there would have been to realize in year one that this guy's a jerk, this is not going to work. And so let me utilize some masculine compassion here and let me just leave him. Let me just sit down and tell him, these are the facts. You're disrespecting my boundaries, disrespecting my values. I'm cutting you off. That's it. Don't call me. I've blocked your number and we're done. But see, a lot of women might feel that doesn't fit their sort of ideals of love, and they've been taught they should love and they should be supportive and all this. And so actually in dragging it out, you make it worse. You have to find when the right kind of compassion is necessary. So you got to be flexible and not rigid in your notion of compassion. Also, for green, caring too much can lead to burnout. You care so much about helping people. Maybe you're a nurse in some hospital and it's like you're trying to help everybody. You're helping this guy and that guy, and that, you're working overtime and all your patients, and you're just overworked. And then eventually you care so much you burn yourself out. Green can be overzealous about social causes. Green can care so much about global warming, so much about animal rights, so much about the Supreme Court, or so much about some issue that they either go overboard, they become extremists, they can even go to the point of doing violent acts, although that's pretty rare for green, but it can happen. You just get caught up with it. Or maybe if you don't even do anything violent or extremist, you just care so much about this cause that eventually it backfires on you and it starts to hurt you emotionally. It's like you care about something so much, but it's not getting fixed just because you care about it. And maybe you want global warming to end, but hey, the fact is that we're in this world where a lot of countries are underdeveloped right now, and we're not going to end global warming anytime soon because new countries are coming online, new factories, new coal, electric power plants, those are still coming online in China and in India, all over the world. So those are some just brutal realities, and sometimes green doesn't want to face those brutal realities because it's a little too idealistic. Another excess of green is green guilt. Guilt makes a comeback. Blue, if you remember, had a lot of guilt in it. It was a sort of puritanical Catholic version of guilt. Then in orange moved away from guilt, and in some sense, orange becomes guiltless and shameless, which is a problem because it's very individualistic. Now the pendulum swings back towards the guilt direction, of course, a different kind of guilt. For green, the guilt is a sort of failure to live up to its ideals of equality and justice for all. So maybe you feel guilty because you are wasting food or you're not recycling, and that's you not living up to your lofty ideals. Or maybe you feel guilty for driving a gas car and for helping to support the big oil industry or the pharma industry or something like that. Or you feel guilty for the company you work at because your company earns dollars or money, and maybe your company exploits some third world country labor. Maybe it has some sweatshops, so you feel guilty about that. Now, of course, green will say, well, Leo, but I should feel guilty about that. Well, that's the whole problem with guilt, is that people who feel guilty, they believe very firmly that they should feel guilty for not living up to their ideals. But the problem is that actually robs you of your power. And guilt is not a very resourceful emotion from which then to act and to change. So rather than feeling guilty, it's better to release that guilt and then do the right thing. Anyways, green can be a little too reactionary, reacting to situations that are happening rather than following through on its own agenda, on its own goals. In its excess, green can stifle independence and it can stifle entrepreneurial spirit. I've heard examples of this happening, for example, in Scandinavian countries, where in Scandinavian countries, the culture there is such that if you try to rise above the average, like in your school or in your university, you try to rise above average, you try to be a little bit of a maverick, then the culture there is designed such that people will look down on you. And maybe you're an entrepreneur and you have some brilliant ideas, but then the culture you're growing up in, it's a little bit too socialistic. And so what happens is that they stifle your creativity and your independence. There can be a sort of green restraint of individuality through harmony. Green tries to get a consensus and a harmony so much that it actually ends up killing healthy forms of individuality as it seeks to get everybody into a sort of green mob. Sometimes in its excess, green can love to talk about spirituality, but actually be unable to embody it. This is a problem. Green can go to yoga classes, green can go to satsangs and listen to gurus and watch Muji videos and talk about love and how wonderful the world is and peace and all of this, but green is not actually able to attain the deep, non-dual mystical states that are necessary to truly be a vehicle of a very deep form of love, unconditional love. Green doesn't yet understand unconditional love. Green's heart is not yet fully open. That will only happen at turquoise, with deep mystical experiences, which green generally isn't disciplined enough to attain. Because true spirituality requires enormous discipline. And in a sense, that was a very nice strength of blue, but that has been sort of long left behind. And now with green, there's a sort of up in the air quality about green where it's airy-fairy. It likes to talk about aliens and UFOs and chakras and crystals and all of this. It talks about this. It burns incense, and it maybe does some meditation practices, but it's not real, like hardcore meditation. It's not hardcore yoga, which is what enables true spirituality. Green can be too entitled. A lot of green people, the reason they're green is simply because they grew up in a culture and in a society which is relatively affluent. First world countries, European countries, in America, we have elements of green in our culture because we've gone through all the other stages, and green can sometimes forget that. Green can forget that green is built on top of orange, and it can feel entitled to things, and it can seem like everybody else in the world should have what green has. But everybody else in the world can't have that unless they go through all those steps that your ancestors had to go through to build all the infrastructure, both the physical and psychological infrastructure to get you, and the economic infrastructure to get you to where you are now. Most third world countries do not have the political infrastructure to allow green governments. That has to evolve through a painful process. And green can be so entitled that it forgets that. Green can deny differences too much. This is one of the things, for example, that Jordan Peterson will rant about, is how green will deny the differences between men and women, between the different curves. There's curves, then there's outliers, and the outliers can be very extreme and very significant. And that's true because green's overarching bigger picture is that everyone is equal. Now, of course, the conservative will say, oh, that's so ridiculous. Everyone is not equal. there's truth in both perspectives. There's a partial truth in both perspectives. Of course, everyone is not equal. Of course, not all cultures are equal. Of course, not all races are equal. Of course, not everyone has the same IQ. Of course, not all the features and characteristics and strengths and weaknesses of men and women are the same. Men and women are asymmetrical. They have different strengths and weaknesses. But what Green is saying when it says everyone is equal is it's saying that everyone should have an equal right to basic, healthcare, housing, economic prosperity. So it doesn't literally mean that men are equal to women. And so there's a sort of a false debate that then gets set up between like blue and orange and green, and they start to argue, and then like the blue and orange side argues, no, we're all different, and the green side argues, no, we're all equal. Well, they're really just talking about the same thing in different ways, and a lot of times they fail to see that because they're too stuck in their own perspective. The problem with Green is that it is too stuck in its own perspective, this perspective of equality. That's an admirable perspective. It's an admirable intention, but again, you can't cling to anything too much. And when you start to turn it into an ideology or a philosophy, what it does is it restricts your creativity, it restricts your fluidity. And then that creates problems. The name of the game here is to have a flexible mind. That's always been the name of the game. That's what I've been trying to teach you with Actualized.org all this time. When I talk about epistemology, I talk about freeing your mind of webs of belief. It's all about freeing your mind. Liberation, that's ultimately what you're going to. You're trying to liberate your consciousness from every single mental construct that holds you down, whether it's a blue construct, an orange construct, or a green construct. Green can have a sort of naive altruism that it turns into a trap. This idea that you can just help everybody. And the problem is that you can't help everybody. You can't just let every homeless person into your house, feed them, clothe them, take care of their medical expenses, give them a therapist for their mental illnesses, and help them with their drug addictions. You can't do that for everybody. And sometimes Green doesn't realize that because it's a little too idealistic. Green can be too trusting of red. Red can exploit Green's empathy and Green's tolerance, and so can orange to a certain extent. Green can romanticize stage purple too much. Green might look at tribal cultures in Africa or in the Middle East or other places, and tribalism is what I mean by tribalism is stage purple, which is a very, very basic early stage in the spiral. It's basically sort of the way that natives live in the Amazon or certain tribes in Africa. And it might seem like those people live in harmony with nature. And look, they have medicine men and they live healthy. They eat healthy food and they treat animals nicely. They don't have factory farming. So in Green's eyes, that can seem like, oh, that's the ideal. But of course, you can't have modern society at the scales we have it at now also at purple. It needs to develop to something different. Purple doesn't work. You're romanticizing it too much. There are evil things that happen within purple that Green, for example, fails to see. For example, purple is very tribalistic. So if you have two tribes living in the Amazon, they will have no problems whatsoever of butchering each other and holding each other as enemies because they are tribes, and that's where we get the word tribal from. They can be extremely tribal. Tribes in Africa can be extremely tribal and brutal to one another. Tribes in the Middle East, that's one of the biggest problems they have in the Middle East, is that they actually don't have a sense of individual nationhood because they have different tribes. Literally, the different families they have there are just like different tribes, and they fight with each other. And so there's too much disunity to actually just build a solid blue civilization nation that has order and hierarchy, because it's tribal warfare. Green's empathy can be exploited and manipulated, and that can be a problem for green. Green can fall into the sort of doormat syndrome, where you become a doormat and you let people walk over you. Green can be bad with finances. Green can overregulate and overtax. Green can eliminate boundaries too much. Some green people think that, countries, we shouldn't have borders at all. Just let all the immigrants in, let anybody go anywhere they want. But of course, the problem is that life is more complicated than that. Survival of every organism depends upon having some kind of boundaries. So it's not a question of having a boundary or not having a boundary. It's a question of how much of a boundary. The devil is in the details of what your boundary should be. For example, if you just let every single, like I said, poor person walk into your house and do whatever they want, they would destroy your house. They would steal all your stuff. So you do have to set some boundaries. The question is, what kind? Reminds me of what happened with Osho's ashram, or Osho's commune in Oregon, if you saw that documentary. Then what happened there is that at one point they started to actually hire buses to drive around the entire United States and pick up homeless people in every city in the United States by the hundreds and thousands, and to bus them into the commune. Well, one of the reasons they were doing that is because they wanted to manipulate the local elections so that they could win their political and sort of real estate battles there with the zoning laws. So that was sort of an orange move, but still they were trying to get these bums and these homeless people and these mentally ill people, and they started to try to care for them. They actually tried to rehabilitate them and give them food and shelter and take care of them. And they tried to show that these people can be loving members of the community. So this was a very lofty sort of high goal, ideal of green. But the problem that they ran into eventually is that they didn't think through the fact that many of these homeless people, they weren't just homeless because they were lazy or because they didn't get a chance by society. It's because many of them were hard drug addicts. Many of them had serious mental issues, psychosis. Many of them were violent. Many of them were criminals and didn't really have a sense of ethics or morality. And so when you bus all those people into your commune, then these bums started to fight, and they started to get so rowdy that eventually the leaders of the Osho commune, they had to actually put tranquilizers and sedative drugs into the beer that they gave to these homeless people to kind of keep them tranquilized and calm down so there wouldn't be all this fights and all these violence. So see, that's an example of green being too idealistic and not really thinking through some of its well-intentioned and heart-centered ideals. It's nice to be able to help homeless people, but you also have to think through what are the actual circumstances that lead to homeless people being homeless. How can we create systemic solutions? That's what you'll start to get to in stage orange or stage yellow. How can we create systemic solutions to actually address those problems in a way that's going to be sustainable? Not just because we love them and we care for them, because love and care doesn't feed a homeless person. And it doesn't solve a homeless person's mental illness. Although sometimes it can. Sometimes all a homeless person needs is just some love, and that can cure him. And that's great, and green is good at that, which is why green makes for good nurses and social workers and psychiatrists, professions where you need a lot of empathy, life coaches. But empathy doesn't solve all problems. Sometimes you have a more fundamental, you might say a more material problem that your compassion is not just going to solve. Maybe these mentally ill people actually need some medication more so than your empathy. Or maybe what they need is they need a job more so than your free handouts. In its excess, green can lie because it doesn't want to hurt the feelings of other people. Green can be unable to tell the brutal truth. And another potentially big problem with green is that it becomes a lesser jihad. I've talked about lesser versus greater jihad in my Understanding Islam episode, and it's a very important concept. The idea here being is that all of these lofty social causes, these political causes that green can have, of civil rights or saving the whales, this sort of stuff, it can become a distraction from the inner work that you have to do on yourself first. Ground yourself deeper in true spirituality and mysticism. Have the non-dual insights. Become enlightened. Then from that position, you will be able to go out and to spread love and happiness and change all throughout the world. You can become a bodhisattva if you want to. But if you get too involved with the political stuff, you get into these mobs and you become a feminist or this or that, and you get so wrapped up into that, you care so much about that, that you forget to actually work on yourself. The greater jihad is what you should be really concerned with. And you should be very concerned with anything that distracts you away from that. Here's some statistics about green. About 10% of the adult global population is green, with up to 30% in Western Europe and in America. It especially depends on states and cities. For example, within America, Northern Europe tends to skew more heavily green. And about 15% of the total world influence, the cultural influence, is green. So this is the influence that happens through the media, through entertainment, through politics, through business, through charities, through non-government organizations. The style of government under green is a social network. It's human-centered. It has a flat hierarchy, decentralized. It's socialist/capitalist hybrid, not purely one or the other. It's liberal. It's globalist. It seeks to create a global community, and it's a melting pot of different cultures and different ideas with tolerance for all the different elements of the pot. Whereas blue doesn't want the melting pot. Blue wants to preserve its national identity, its heritage, its tradition, which is why blue is so against green. The green elitist globalists, what is this? This is a triggering point for blue because blue wants to maintain its identity. Of course, the whole point of conscious development, the whole point of self-actualization is to destroy your identity. You see, any identity you have, whether it's a blue identity, an orange identity, a green identity, all of these are false identities. Your identity as a physical body is a false identity. Your identity with your personal history, your story, the idea that you were ever born, this is a false identity. Your self-image is a false identity. All of your cultural associations, whether you think you're a feminist or whether you think you're an alt-right conservative, or whether you think you're a Jew, whatever race you think you are, whatever gender you think you are, whether you think you're gay or transsexual or bisexual or straight or anything, alpha male, beta male, incel, female, male, it doesn't matter. All of these are false identities. If you think you're an American, if you think you're a German, if you think you're an Arab, if you think you're a Muslim, all of these are false identities. And of course, that is very upsetting to the ego. The ego is identity. It's all about identity. It's about individual identity, but also collective identity. Your individual identity is very much tied in with your collective identity, no matter what stage you're at, pretty much. So, of course, what I'm saying here is going to be unpopular with stage blue, stage orange, stage green. It only starts to make sense to you when you get to the really high levels, to yellow and really even to turquoise. And you start to have some non-dual experiences when you start to realize that all of these identities are just masks. They're all just roles. It's all just programming. You have to leave it all behind. Don't cling to any of it. So, how do you transcend green? Well, first of all, read in depth about green. As you read about green, you realize its limitations, and that's important. Also, read in depth about yellow, because yellow is the next stage. You need to start to distinguish the difference between green and yellow, and you need to start to see how much more wise yellow is than green. And if you're stuck in orange and blue, and maybe you don't like green because you feel like they're neo-Marxists and that they are too idealistic and they're too collectivist. Well, remember that the pendulum is going to swing back in the opposite direction. With yellow, it's going to go more individualistic. And so in a sense, orange will resonate with yellow much more so than with green. But it would be a mistake to try to skip over to yellow without going through green first. So for green, read about yellow, which I'll talk about in the next episode, so I won't cover that much here. Also, very important that green stops judging orange, blue, and yellow. Like with every stage, the biggest obstacle for you growing into the next level is that you judge it too much. What green judges about yellow is that green will think that yellow is too dispassionate. It doesn't care enough about social causes, and that yellow is too neutral. Green doesn't want neutrality. Green wants to mobilize, to go protest, to go be an activist. Whereas yellow steps back and yellow says, wait a minute, let's think it through. Before we start to protest and take all these actions and become active, let's think through this very systemically, which is something that green doesn't really know how to do and doesn't appreciate. Stop demonizing corporations. Stop demonizing money. Stop demonizing conservatives. Stop demonizing religion. This is a problem that you will see, for example, with some of the progressive YouTube channels that talk about politics, like with the Young Turks, TYT. You also see a little bit with Sam Cedars' Majority Report and Democracy Now. They demonize orange and they demonize blue too much. And so what this does is it creates a polarization. You get this polarization happening in our society now between green and blue-orange. And that creates a sort of stalemate, creates a nasty sort of politics where nothing really gets done. So you got to be careful about that. Sometimes green can fail to see why demonizing orange and blue is a problem. Oftentimes a progressive will say, Leo, but if we don't demonize them and we don't speak out against the fascists, then we're not being proactive enough. And they're just going to use their fascist tactics against us, and they're going to steamroll us, and then everything is going to go to hell. No, actually, that's a trap. That's a trap. When you think that way, what's happening is you're getting polarized. And the sort of polarization is actually the thing that is keeping society in a stalemate. So there are a lot of counterintuitive mechanics here that go into really changing society for the better. And if you really care about that, you really care about making progress, then try to get to yellow as quickly as you can, because it's at yellow where you start to really be able to solve society's problems in a systemic manner, which tends to be much more effective than green. Stop caring about social issues so much. Yes, social issues are important, but also you need to see the other side of the coin, that they're not important at all. Society is progressing at exactly the rate that it needs to be progressing at. Society is perfect for this exact moment in time that it is in. That can be hard to swallow. Notice that politics is still ego. Just because you have some lofty green politics of saving Mother Earth and saving the animals and this and that and whatever else, this is still ego. It's collective ego. Sure, it's a better form of ego than maybe red politics or blue politics or orange politics, but it's still ego. And it's still gonna distract you. It's gonna be a red herring from doing the real inner self-actualization work that we need you to do to go higher. Acknowledge that business is necessary. Acknowledge that green is not the highest stage, that there are higher stages beyond you. Acknowledge the problem with green mob mentality. Notice that green goes overboard with its collective networks. Start thinking more for yourself. Start seeing the world more from the lower stages, points of view. Start to understand why blue is blue, and what are the legitimate aspects of blue, and why orange is orange, and what are the legitimate aspects of orange. Start to empathize and see why people are in each of these stages and why they can't just instantly break out and become green. That will move you into yellow as you start to look at reality from multiple points of view, and you start to see every point of view as having a partial truth to it. Acknowledge that most of the world wasn't as lucky as you. They're not as educated as you. Most people were not born in a first world country, and they did not go to a world class or even even any kind of university, not even world class, any kind of university. Most people didn't even go to a progressive liberal elementary school, middle school, or high school like you did. So that's huge, because education correlates with your level of consciousness and your level of development very strongly here. So, most people didn't have that privilege, which means we need to educate more people. But educating people is difficult, because once you get the wrong education, that education makes your mind rigid, such that then we can't educate you for the right education, for the more open-minded sort of education. So acknowledge that that's a very deep problem that you're not just going to solve by protesting or by telling people that they're closed-minded, or by telling them that they're evil or they're fascists. Acknowledge that bigots and racists can't help what they're doing. People who are bigots and racists, they are acting out of ignorance, as are criminals, as are all people. We all act out of ignorance. This is not an excuse, it's just the way that it is. So this is a sort of meta understanding, which helps you to understand and also stand at a distance from some of these human rights abuses that you see happening all over the world. Then you'll stop being triggered by bigotry and racism. Now, of course, Green will say, Leo, but I don't want to stop being triggered by bigotry and racism, because that will just enable the racists and the bigots. No, what you'll realize at stage yellow is that when you stop being triggered and you actually understand everything, including all the evil in the world, the so-called evil, this doesn't enable the evil. This counterintuitively actually is the solution to the problem of evil. You don't stop evil by fighting evil with evil. You stop it with love and with understanding. And Green have a problem with this, because Green still hasn't learned the lesson that you need to be so loving and so tolerant that you can even tolerate intolerance. The problem with Green is that Green is intolerant towards intolerance. There's a lack of self-reflection there, a lack of fully understanding what intolerance is, a lack of fully understanding what ignorance is and why conflict happens. It's very important as Green that you seek to understand the deeper causes of war, violence, cruelty, and conflict. These things don't just happen because of evil corporations or evil politicians. There are much deeper dynamics beyond any individual at work that cause these things. In fact, what you will ultimately realize is that all of these things are the direct manifestation of the very fundamental structure of reality. God itself is the ultimate cause of war, violence, cruelty, abuse, hatred, genocide, bigotry, rape, and all of these things that you hate and that you protest against. And in fact, all of these things are a part of you. You are it. You are all of it. Because reality is infinite, and so it must include all of these things. But you won't understand that until you get much, much higher up in your level of consciousness. But it's good to start to do a little research, to start to see the complexities of all this sort of stuff. You can't just react against it with protests and with violence and with demonization. So stop hating the haters. That's really tough to do. That's very counterintuitive. Start studying systems thinking. That's huge. I have a whole category on my book list called systems thinking with some really good books there. As you start to read about systems thinking, you will start to realize the limitations of green, and that will move you into yellow. Acknowledge that green's political actions are often very ineffective. There's a lot of commotion, a lot of yelling and screaming and emotions, but nothing really changes. So maybe there's a better way. Acknowledge green hypocrisy. What is green hypocrisy? Well, it's when you demonize the big oil companies for polluting the environment, and yet what do? You drive a gas car, and you go to the Chevron gas station on the corner and you fill up with your gas. And maybe you also demonize giant corporations for corrupting the political system with their lobbying and all this sort of stuff. But then where do you get your paycheck? You work for some company like AT&T, or you work for Verizon, or you work for Coca-Cola, or you work for some other company. And maybe you're in some low position. Maybe you're a secretary, or maybe you're just a store clerk. But nevertheless, you're part of the problem. That's green hypocrisy. Stop acting self-righteous and superior. Green can develop that problem in its excess. There's a sort of like air of morality about green, in the same way that blue also had this kind of air of morality and self-righteous indignation. But that's holding you back in your development. You need to see that we're really all in this together. We're so together in this that even all the stuff that you see that's going against your social justice warrior values, that even all that stuff is still you. It's still all part of reality. You can't just have the good side of reality. You can't just have Mother Nature and rainbows and butterflies and unicorns and peace for everybody, but then not have conflict and violence and war and genocide and rape and theft. They come together. They come as a package. Which doesn't mean we can't improve the situation. But if you're always triggered by it, emotionally, that's a problem. Because when you're emotionally triggered, you're not thinking straight. You're not really conscious. And so you can't really come up with the solutions necessary. And also, it disturbs you on the inside. You don't have peace of mind, which is ultimately what you're after. Just in general, be less idealistic and be more nuanced in how you think about these sorts of issues. Start practicing some serious meditation, not in some group setting, but like really serious all by yourself. Serious meditation, serious yoga, not the stuff you see in gym classes. Self-inquiry. Self-inquiry can really help you to go beyond green, because it's a hard-nosed practice. There's not a lot of bullshit happening within self-inquiry. You're sitting down, it's just you and the truth and reality. You're just breaking everything down, breaking your identity down, breaking down all your beliefs and all your social causes, breaking all of it down. Start reading yellow and turquoise books. And if you're looking for a good list of those, well, check my book list. I have a ton of yellow and turquoise books on my book list. Start reading spiral dynamics. Just reading about spiral dynamics in depth can be enough to shift you from green to yellow, because spiral dynamics is the epitome of yellow thinking, this model. To see all the stages, how all of them are necessary, how all of them work together, how complex and nuanced it all is, how tricky it all is, that's what moves you into yellow. Start to study non-duality. That's going to be important to move you up. Start to deconstruct meaning, value, and purpose. Ooh, that's a big one. People have trouble with that. See my episode about understanding meaning, value, and purpose. I have a whole episode about that, which tells you that you can deconstruct it because your mind invented it. And that is what is ultimately underpinning your social causes and your fight for equality and liberty and justice. Make sure you fully integrate orange and you don't just react against it or deny it. And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is to start a business. If you're green and if you struggle with finances, there's nothing better than just starting a business and learning to deal with all the challenges and realities of starting a business. To have a successful business and to maintain it, that requires some real skill, some real pragmatic thinking that a lot of green people haven't fully learned how to integrate. So that can be great. And once you do start your own business, you will understand why business works the way that it works and why it's so problematic and why it's so difficult to get these corporations to stop doing all this selfish and evil stuff. Because really what you start to understand when you really understand business, you start to understand that, oh, what business is business is just like survival of the fittest, except before 2,000 years ago, we would be slitting each other's throats. And now what we're doing is we're just polluting a little bit and we're suing each other in court and we're having some little corporate disputes. That's peanuts compared to the way that business used to be done. Business used to be someone slitting your throat, exterminating your entire tribe and enslaving all the women and children and raping them. That's what business used to be. So business has evolved a lot in the last 2,000 years, and it will continue to do so. And it helps for you to start to understand that, because you know what? Business is just survival. And you know what? As long as you're alive, you got to survive. You got to pay the bills. If you're green, you still got bills to pay. You still got to pay your rent and buy your food and buy your gas, buy your car and all this sort of stuff, pay for daycare, pay for medical expenses. How do you do that? By participating in Orange. But the problem is that a lot of green people, they participate in Orange, but at the same time, they sort of deny that they do it. They just say, oh, Leo, I don't do anything evil. I just go and work for my corporation. But what is that? That's contributing to all the evil, all the corporate lobbying, all that stuff. If you work for a giant corporation, even if you're just like flipping burgers at McDonald's and you fancy yourself a green person because you're not some big wig CEO who gets some big corporate golden parachute or some severance package or takes home hundreds of millions in stock options. You don't get that flipping burgers at McDonald's, but you're part of the system. You're serving the system. That CEO couldn't exist without you being part of the system. So you got to ask yourself, how do I break myself out of the system? If I really want to be truly green, then I will make myself financially independent and I will create my own job, my own business, which is actually serving the community in a positive way. Because if I have lofty green ideals, but then I go work for a corporation like Coca-Cola, which basically sells sugared poison to children all around the world and is destroying their health, then what you're doing is you're participating in that. But you tell yourself, oh, but I have to, because if I don't do that, then I got no job, right? Because you haven't taken responsibility yet for creating your own job. That's difficult to do. And to create your own job in such a manner that you don't do it by exploiting other people or exploiting the environment, that's really hard to do. That's really hard to do. Very few human beings have undertaken the task of creating a career for themselves that does not feed off the exploitation of other human beings or the environment. So take on that challenge. And if you want some help with that, check out my Life Purpose course. That's what that is about. Helping you to design that. Because that's what I did. And man, is that rewarding. That's so rewarding. That's so much more rewarding than having your lofty green ideals, but then working for some shitty multinational corporation. So much more rewarding. To transcend green, practice more neutrality. It might seem that neutrality is a bad thing, but actually it's much superior to being polarized. Neutrality. At Yellow, you will learn true neutrality. True neutrality is not what you think it is. I will talk about it in the next episode on Yellow. Notice that protesting is not enough in many cases. Yes, sure, sometimes protests work in the civil rights movement. Protests were great. They were important. Protests definitely have a function. I'm not saying never protest, but also realize that there's a lot of problems that exist in the world that go way beyond protesting. And that talking, dialoguing is not enough. Love and peace is often not enough. We need to think about these problems in a much deeper systemic manner. Become a spiral wizard. What is a spiral wizard? Well, if you read the Spiral Dynamics book, you will learn about what a spiral wizard is. A spiral wizard is basically someone who's at Yellow. It's someone who who knows how to communicate and jump back and forth between the spiral, all the different stages, and knows how to design systems that accommodate all the stages on the spiral rather than just advocating for his own stage. The whole problem with stage blue, orange, and green is that they're all blind to the fact that they're just one stage of a larger whole. And so when they advocate some sort of policy or governmental program or some sort of religious or spiritual teaching, they only advocate it as though they are the right stage. It's like green is the right one, or orange is the right one, or blue is the right one. And that whole thing misses the point. There's a larger, higher meta point to see. When you see the whole thing from a bigger picture, you realize, oh, the real solutions need to not just be from my stage, they need to be for all the stages on the entire spiral. And that's when you become yellow, when you really grasp that. And lastly, the master key, as with all the other stages for transcending a stage, is contemplation and self-reflection. Carefully sit down and think through all the stuff I talked about, read the books, check out my book list, take some notes, and then contemplate about it, journal about it. Think about how you're falling into these traps, think about the limitations, think about which elements of orange or blue maybe you skipped over, you didn't quite fully integrate. Think about what more within green you need to act out in order to be at peace with it so you can move on to yellow. I am not advocating that you skipped through green as quickly as possible. Make sure not to make that mistake. People might get the sense that, oh, well, the whole goal of this model, Leo, is to become turquoise, right? That's the best one. So what I need to do is quickly skip through all the stages to get to turquoise. No, that is not the goal. First of all, turquoise is not the best stage. There is no best stage. So that's number one. Number two is that even if turquoise was the best stage, you can't get to it by skipping through stages. Never mind skipping over stage. Right now I'm talking about skipping through a stage. That means sort of just like speeding through it, looking for a shortcut. Don't look for a shortcut. Look to master the stage. So if you're in orange right now, and maybe you're only halfway through orange, you got to master the other half. Learn all the lessons that orange has to teach you, both its strengths and its weaknesses. When you're deeply, intimately familiar with its strengths and its weaknesses, then you can move on to green. Same thing with green. Now you're in green, maybe you're just 10, 20% green. That means you still got a lot left to learn from green. So go into it, spend a few years fully mucking around in green, read green books, go to green seminars, go to green music festivals, talk to green people, befriend them, join green Facebook groups, do all that sort of stuff. But as you're doing that, also keep an eye towards yellow so you don't get stuck in green. That's the danger with going too deeply into a stage. You can get stuck in it. So fully exhaust green such that you naturally then want to evolve into yellow. All right, so that's green in a lot of detail. In conclusion, I just want to give you a couple of caveats. Number one, be careful about stereotyping people using this model. That is not the point of this model. Notice how complex this model really is. It's a lot more complicated than you can even fathom even now. And you might already think it's complex because I've spent so many hours talking about it. And we've only covered 3 stages in like 5 or 6 hours of talking. So that tells you how complex it is. And we're still just scratching the surface. As you read the book and so forth, and you read different other books that supplement it, and you think about systems thinking, you will see more and more of the complexity. So this is not a simplistic model where you can just walk around town and label people, oh, that guy's blue, this guy's red, and that guy's orange, oh, look at that stupid green person. Oh, no, that's not what this model is for. This model is also not for advancing your political agenda. In these episodes, it might seem like, Leo, you're talking about politics so much. Why are you getting so political? I'm getting political because, first of all, these are great examples, and I want you to actually understand what is going on in politics. But the reason I'm getting political is not so that Actualized.org and personal development becomes a political thing, but actually the opposite, so that you can start to see politics from a meta perspective, so that you can start to see politics from an ego perspective, you can start to see the collective ego operating within politics and all the forces, and then you can rise above the fray. That's why we get political here. It's very dangerous to mix personal development with politics, because politics is a huge distraction. And like I said, politics is ego. And personal development is all about shedding your ego. So mixing these two together makes for a bad combination. So in the future, I will be sometimes talking about politics, but again, always when I talk about politics is to get you to rise above it. Because otherwise what happens is that people just get into a mud-flinging contest. It's like a giant food fight. You're either on the left or the right, and you're just throwing food at each other. This is not going to grow you. This is not going to solve society's problems. You need to rise above that. You need to see, why is there a food fight to begin with? What's really going on? Why are people throwing food at each other? And why am I getting sucked into the fight? It's really hard not to get sucked in, because you do have certain positions, and there are certain things you really care about. Maybe you really care about abortion rights, or maybe you really care about stopping abortion. And that's fine. Whatever position you've got there, that's fine. But also realize there's a deeper point, is that you're clinging to it. And that's an agenda of your ego. And that is ultimately something you're going to have to surrender. And you probably don't like hearing that. And that's why whenever I talk about politics, people will criticize me and say, "Oh, Leo, but look, you're for this position, you're against that position." No, of course, I do have my personal political biases and positions, but that's not what I'm trying to imprint into your mind. I'm trying to show you something beyond that, much, much, much beyond that. So that's green for you. Yellow is the next stage, which we'll be talking about in the episode to come. All right, that's it for this. Please click the like button for me. Come check out Actualized.org. That's my website. I've got resources for you there. Check out my blog, check out the forum, check out the book list, check out the life purpose course. All of those can really change your life in one way or another. Even just a little thing that I post on my blog can trigger an insight in you, or can be a resource that you follow up on, a book that you read, or a video that you watch that changes the whole trajectory of your life. It's the little things that add up that make a difference. And lastly, just stick with me. We still have more stages to cover. Stage yellow is going to be a really important stage, a very advanced stage. Many people will not be able to understand it, but if you're watching Actualized.org, then chances are you're already around green, and maybe you have a healthy amount of orange, of yellow. But you haven't fully grasped what yellow is. Yellow is such a deep and profound thing. As I was studying and preparing for all these episodes, my understanding of yellow has deepened, even though I feel like I've been at yellow for a long time. I really love yellow. We'll talk about that next time. And one last thing I want to tell you is, help me to build a giant list of examples for each one of these stages. So on my forum, I'm creating a mega thread, a special thread for every single color of the spiral. We've already done a blue one, an orange one. We're going to start a green one just after I release this episode here. And we'll have a yellow and a turquoise one where we just post examples of YouTube videos that are like the perfect epitomes of green or blue or orange, and someone can just go through, watch those videos, see those examples, and just really clearly get a strong sense of what that stage is all about. So if you know some cool examples of green that you want to share, you can post that on the forum there. Or if you don't want to post, you can just go read it, and you will learn about what green is just from reading that long mega thread.